A second issue, after refugees, that came to my attention as I continued to serve on the National Security Council staff in 1975 and 1976, after the Vietnam War was over, was that of POW MIAs. Now, the Paris Agreement that Henry Kissinger had signed with Le Duc Tho in 1973, under which all American military personnel were withdrawn from Vietnam, from South Vietnam, and we ended our involvement in the war, had in it provisions that all American POWs had to be returned by North Vietnam to us, and they had to provide other accounting for American who had not, whose fate had not been determined. But the big thing was releasing the POWs. And that occurred in June of 1973 as the last American fighting units were withdrawn. And there were these turnover ceremonies that were very heart-wrenching when our men were boarded onto planes in North Vietnam and flown out and flown and reunited with their families in the Philippines or at other U.S. military bases. But there were still more than 2,500 American service members who had not been fully accounted for. Either they were dead, it was known, could be confirmed that they were dead, some other American saw them die, but we had not been able to retrieve their bodies and bring their bodies home, their remains home. And there were others whose fate was less than certain, and about whom it was not clear whether they had died. So the U.S. government, and particularly the Defense Department, were committed to obtaining what was referred to as the fullest possible accounting. So we might not be able to have definitive information about those men, but we had to be committed to do our best. So during the war itself, to ensure that the POWs were not forgotten about, a number of the wives of the POWs banded together. There's a wonderful book by a woman named Heath Lee. It's got an Iowa connection called League of Wives. And it describes how the wives of particular service members became advocates and lobbying the government not to allow their husbands to be forgotten. And so even after all the POWs were released in ¡73, the issue continued to be out there. And letters would be received about what we're doing about particular cases. There were now organizations called the League of Families, which would hold regular conventions. And President Ford went to speak once, so I got to sit in the Oval Office with him and the speechwriters and his political staff, going over the remarks, and he's asking questions. And since I knew more about the POW issue than any of his political staff, they wanted me to be involved to help guide them to say things that were technically correct and which would address the concerns that the families had. This was now my involvement that would continue again and again and be part of my professional diplomatic career at the State Department. So these two post-war issues, refugees and POW MIA accounting, would play a huge part in the remainder of my career. They were foreign policy issues that became domestic issues. They had, and they brought up very intense feelings, and they also led to terrible, terrible conspiracy theories that there were live Americans and somehow the government was in an insidious way turning our backs on them and allowing them to remain in captivity. Movies were made about rescues that were done, and suspicions grew about American officials. Were they betraying the fighting men who had sacrificed so much for our country? I would deal with all of these issues from 1975 until 1999 when I retired.